All right, finally. Let's start. You want to give an intro?
So I'm Ganor from Certora, a tech lead. And
I'm Dhairya Sethi. I'm from Aave Labs. We are a service provider under the Aave DAO. About a year and a half ago, we put out a proposal, and we were selected by the DAO to build the next iteration of Aave V4. Our talk is about the security blueprint and how we engineered Aave V4, some new features, and some takeaways for your development practices as engineering teams. So let's start. What Aave V4 introduces. So I've already taken a scan that everybody knows what Aave is. So I think we're familiar with the architecture. One of the major things that we changed with Aave V4, so as we know that whenever you deploy an Aave V3 market, it's a standalone market which has the liquidity provisioning and borrowing strategy compiled together. One of the major architectural changes with Aave V4 is that it makes this architecture more modular by splitting the liquidity provisioning and borrow strategy in two components called the hub and the spoke. But why do we need this new architecture? While seeing the evolution of Aave V3 and seeing where it has reached today, we realized that Aave V3, for example, right now only supports tokenized assets, and it's very hard to bring more asset classes into the mix. By separating the liquidity provisioning part, you can have more exotic asset classes in a much simpler manner because the architecture is very plug and play. You can plug any hub to any spoke, essentially. So, for example, you can collateralize your LP position on Uniswap while it's earning LP fees. Or you can connect to another liquidity provisioning infrastructure, which is built by somebody else. It just needs to follow the interface. That's all. Another key aspect of this new architecture is that when new markets come about, for example, as we see, let's say that the standard spoke is what Aave V4 has built, which is an Aave V3 borrow market. Whenever new asset classes come into play, when they've legitimized and they've gained some traction, like an RWAs, real-world assets, and users want access to that. Right now, we have to spin up the market from scratch and bootstrap the liquidity from zero. But with Aave V4, they can just get a normal credit line. The users from another spoke get exposure to this new asset class and can enjoy good properties. The first component, the hub, is the central liquidity source. It's an extremely simple contract. It's supposed to be as extensible and modular as possible. The idea is that it only tracks the total supplied, the total borrowed, and the total owed assets. And it does not try to do anything else. When we have a spoke, the idea is this is where users shop for different borrowing terms. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a lending market. It can be any kind of exotic things that can access and use deep liquidity, some of which we'll see in a while. What's to come in the talk? We're going to talk about risk premiums and how we implemented something which most lending protocols don't, which is variable interest rates for each borrow position. We're going to see why this is important. What are the design challenges that we faced while building this and how we fixed it. Then we're going to introduce a new paradigm that we learned during the development of Aave V4, which is called prover-driven development. We're going to talk about how this accelerated the development of V4 and some tips apart from this as well. One thing in most lending protocols in Aave V3 and Aave V3 is, let's say, for example, you and I, we're both opening a position of the same value by borrowing Go. I back my position by using a collateral, like we talked about that now we can bring different asset classes into the system. Let's say that I'm borrowing against an LP token, tokenized, and you're borrowing against ETH, the same value. In Aave V3 and in most lending protocols, you and I pay the same borrow rate on our loan. But that doesn't seem fair because your token, ETH, has no risk attached to it, has less risk than my collateral because my collateral has an additional smart contract risk, has an additional pricing risk, for example. But you and I are both paying the same rate. So I think something's wrong. I think someone's getting screwed here because you're basically paying for my risk, which is not fair. So in Aave V3, what we introduce is risk premiums. It's a new feature where borrowers who back their loans with riskier collateral pay a higher rate, pay a higher premium. What this enables us to do is that from before a higher base rate, the base rate goes down, and if you have some exotic collateral which has more risk or more implied volatility, risk managers can define a particular risk for it, and you pay an additional premium. This essentially incentivizes borrowers to back their loans with less risky collateral because they pay less. And as you can see, the base rate for ETH went down. Earlier, it was paying for the risk for from somebody else because the Go suppliers, they were still getting a risk average return, so they were fine, but not the person borrowing from ETH. And this is good for suppliers because risky positions pay more, so they earn a higher yield. So risk premiums help us precisely price risk.
Thank you. So, so how can you do this? How can we precisely tailor a borrow position rate specifically for each user so they have different rates as riskier the collateral goes? So one way to do it is to use, let's say the base rate is 5%. Let's say an example, 5% base rate and 1,000 Go at that. And let's say the risk, collateral risk is 40%, which is just a number that the risk managers determine that this is the risk that collateral brings. We can have the effective rate of the borrower will be 7%, which is basically 5% times 1.4, extra 40%. And now the effective rate is 7%, which means that after a year, we will pay 70 Go in interest, which is 50 interest, and then extra 20 in fees. So let's see how it works for a couple of users, because we need, at the end, we need the hub to be able to extrapolate what is the total amount that user owes to the hub, so we can determine how much he owes to the LPs. So let's say Alice has 1,000 Go debt with 10% risk, and Bob has 2,000 Go debt with 30% risk. We need to calculate the weighted average of those two users, because they are the total users in this example. We need to know what is the weighted average of them to allow the hub to extrapolate what is the amount that a user owes to it and what he owes to the rest. So we just take Alice's balance times Alice's risk plus Bob's balance times Bob's risk divided by a total of debt that exists, and we get 23.33%, which is the weighted average. This is not precise. There is rounding here because of this division. We could round up or down. If we round up, we'll over-promise to the LPs, and if we round down, we under-promise. So it's better to round down and round against the user in a way, and then we don't overpromise and we're still solvent. So let's see what happens if we remove Alice from the system by repaying. So if Alice repays, we just need to remove her from the weighted average, which basically means that we take the total debt times the old total debt times the old weighted average, then we subtract Alice debt times Alice risk divided by the new total, which basically turns out it's 29.99, and it's not 30. Why should it be 30? It's because Bob is now the only user of the system, which means that the weighted average of the system should be Bob. But Bob collateral risk is 30%. It is 29.99%. It looks negligible, but every time we do an operation, this will compound. Every time it will be less and less precise. So this is wrong. So what went wrong? The division. As I said, once we divide, as everyone knows, when divide, we have rounding, either round up or round down, or round up or down. So if we just didn't have this division, everything would be precise. So, of course, we just remove the division, and then everything should work. But it's hard, because the weighted average is a very intuitive way to do this. Because we have the weighted average of all of the users together, just multiply, and then we have the numbers we want. How can we do it in a different way? We just need to rephrase the problem. Instead of adding the percentage of risk to the interest, we just add the percentage of risk to the amount. Basically, instead, everyone has the same base interest. From before, it was like 5% base, and different amounts. So the effective rate is higher, but the real rate is the same. Just the amount is different. Let's see the same example as before with one user. So same base rate, 5%, same base debt, which is 1,000 Go, and 40% risk collateral. Now, instead of 7% effective rate, which is, again, 5% times 1.4, extra 40%, it's 7. We just have the same base, 1,000 Go, with 5% interest, and we have extra 400 premium ghost debt, which basically, which is the same 5%, which is basically a debt that we only pay interest for. We don't pay the principal, which means that after a year, again, we'll have 50 from the interest, an extra 20 from the 400 premium debt. 20 is like 5% out of 400. So it's the same 5% for everyone, same rate, but different effective rate. And let's see what happens with the 2 users from before. So we have, again, Alice and Bob. 1,000 go for Alice, 10%, and 2,000 go for Bob with 30%. Instead of doing the weighted average with the division and everything, we just sum everything up. We take 100 premium debt for Alice and 600 premium debt for Bob, which is basically just the debt times the risk. And we sum everything up, and we have this exact total. We didn't have divisions here. That's why it's precise. Now, when Alice repays our debt, like before, we just subtract Alice's position from the totals. We don't need to divide, we don't need to multiply. That's why everything is precise. You can see that 700 minus 100 is 600, which is the premium, Go premium debt, which is basically exactly what Bob has. So now the hub state is like Bob's state, exactly. So now it's precise.
I think that made sense. Let's continue with the security practices that we learned during the development of Aave V4. So before we start, there's something that as developers I really want to stress. You should get involved with auditors as early as possible in your, whenever you start designing a new protocol. We got involved with Certora at the design stage. And one of the major things that we did was we started defining properties very early on, essentially before we got too attached to our code. As developers, because we spend so much time on things, we start to get a tunnel vision of sorts when it comes to defining what we want. For example, let's say that you start out with the goal of making a circle. And while you're developing, you realize, okay, there are certain things that are inhibited by the development, by implementation details or something else. Maybe the goal changed, maybe requirements changed from somebody else. Midway, you realize, oh, well, actually, I need a triangle. Now you have two options at this time. Either you can power through, you continue, or you change. If you power through and you continue, you start molding it into something it may not be, or even if it comes out to that. You start applying patches. It may work, but at that point, you're just fixing things. You're not building things. And what this means is that as you start making patches, there could be gaping holes in your system that were missed by the auditors or by yourself because you spent so much time on just thinking about this. Another approach that you could take is instead of fixing, you start changing things. You start from the bottom up, and you start with the learnings from the previous time invested, you start building from scratch.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, to rephrase what Dhairya said, is that we first need to know what we want to do, which is, and in this example, is a lending protocol with risk premiums. And then we can think about the properties we want to have to make it safe. So we need to, at the start, we need to do the design properties, let's call it, when you know what we want to do, which is, for example, here in lending protocol, that the protocol is solvent. And then when you want to know how you want to do it, when you try to implement, when you try to design or try to plan your implementation, you see how you want to do it. And then you can think about properties of implementation-specific properties, like some variables should not be zero, should not be like any kind of different properties regarding the specific implementation. Once you have these two critical times, in the start when you know what you want to do, and in the middle when you know how you want to do it, then you want to you want it in English, and then you want to formalize your properties in CVL, Certora Verification Language, which basically helps our prover to translate your English into mathematical formulas, and now we can know if your code is correct or not. And this process, as Dhairya said, is very iterative, because maybe during development we discover that what we want to develop is too hard, impossible, or just not what marketing wants, not what business wants. We talk with them and then they decide they want something else. We can change things when we can rediscover what we want and how we want to do it. But when we do it, we need to explicitly do it. We can't just think in our head we have one thing and then do something else. So that's why every time you change your mind, you need to rephrase the properties, rephrase the behavior you want to have, and that's okay. That's completely, that's great even, because you're developing, you're making new ground and new ideas. and the prover can help us find both the design issues and implementation issues as long as you formalize your properties correctly. So now let's go to the most important property that we prove for the hub, which share rate doesn't go down. For this property basically means that the protocol is solvent. So of course everyone wants, all of the protocols will be solvent. Everyone wants to be solvent, and this definition is very hard because protocol solvency, it has a couple of different meanings depending on the protocol. For example, if we have a protocol like Aave V3, it has index-based approach, which basically means that the amount of liabilities the protocol has is the amount of shares that exist times the index, the supply index in Aave V3, for example, and that is the total liabilities the protocol owe to the LPs. And the amount of assets that the protocol has is the total debt plus liquidity, and we just need the assets cover the liabilities. That's very easy. It's very easy to formalize the property. It's very easy to check it. And if, for example, I add this malicious function, just steal money from the protocol, for example, I can just call the function, take all of the money away, you could immediately notice that the property will fail because the assets will go down, the liabilities won't go down, and that means that we just lost money and the property will be violated. But in Aave V4, for example, we don't use index, we use share rate. And share rate is just take the total assets, divide by total shares, and that is the supply share rate for the user. And because of this definition, the previous property as I described it is true, is just true always. Because if we have this magic function, just steal all of the money from the protocol, now we have 0 assets. Basically, to recalculate the share rate, it will be 0. Total assets divided by total assets, which is 0 because we stole everything, divided by amount of shares, it's 0, because 0 divided by something is 0. And then the obligations, the liability of the protocol is 0. So total asset is 0, the liability of the protocol is 0, and that's true, but money got stolen. So that's bad. It means that we didn't check what we really wanted to check. What we want to check here is that share rate cannot go down, because if share rate goes down, it means that someone took more assets from the protocol than what he redeemed in shares, or just got free assets because he just stole money from the protocol. And share rate going down means that someone stole your funds. If share rate go up, it means you profit. If share rate go down, it means someone stole and you got socialized and got part of the loss, all of the loss, if you have a lot of shares. And that's what we proved. We proved that share rate cannot go down, which means that the hub is always solvent. No matter what kind of spoke we will build and what logic it will do, the share rate cannot go down always. The hub does all of the check to promise that the hub is always solvent.
During the development of Aave V4, as we've talked about, you need to start writing your properties early on. One of the benefits of that is once you've developed such a modular and extensible architecture and a protocol, these properties come very handy. As we know, the hub can connect to any kinds of spokes, any exotic borrowing strategies. It does, actually, not even borrowing strategies, anything that can do something with liquidity, essentially. Now that we have the hub properties written in, tinkering and experimenting with new kinds of spoke designs is extremely easy and straightforward because you type out your hub property, your spoke, you can test it against the implementation very soon and find out if it's compatible and if it does not break any core invariants of the protocol. Because you just need to adhere to the hub interface and run the Certora Prover once. This way you can test and tinker with your ideas and accelerate your development quite fast. One thing we also learned during the development was we had multiple iterations where we tried a lot of different ideas to make different kinds of features work. Most of them are not covered here, but you can check out other talks or our blog posts for that. You should start writing your protocols as prototypes so that you can iterate on them and work on them faster. Another tip that I have is also consider using, so as we know that the Certora Prover is a symbolic engine, consider using lighter SMTs like Z3 such that you can script and type out smaller parts of your code faster. Like maybe you're doing some extrapolation on the hub or on some level, and you want to figure out if these roundings work after thinking about whether they're in the favor of the protocol or not. Really quickly to conclude, Aave V4, because of the secure development, opens up a lot of design space, and some examples could be that, like we've talked about, you can collateralize LP positions. One more is that because of the way that risk premiums work, they're very modular and extensible. They can be built not just on your collateral, because the current market works just like a V3 market. They can work on your entire position, like an options market, where your risk premium is sort of exactly equivalent to a margin, for example. That's all from our side. Our V4 code is live. Check out the properties. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.